So my understanding is we have Dr. Susan MacManus on the phone with us this morning. She is a professor at USF, and she is one of the local political gurus of all things. So are you with us this morning, Dr. MacManus?
Well, I think so.
Sorry about our delays getting a hold
of
of you. We had some phone issues this morning, so very, very blessed to have you with us, and want to jump right to it. So it was a very interesting poll, and we kind of talked about this on last week's show about the Florida governor race, and it showed Charlie Crist ahead of Rick Scott, about 41-29. Then it had a third-party candidate, Adrian Wiley, in about almost 9%. So wanted to get your thoughts on that shifting. Do you think that there's this sentiment shifting away from support for Governor Scott? I mean, I think a lot of positive things had been in the press for a while, and it seemed like he was actually garnering pretty solid numbers. But the horse race at this point seems like we're seeing a little bit of a different trend, a different direction. What are your thoughts?
Well, I'm really very distrustful of horse race polls this far out. Most of the time they're just name recognition, and they ebb and flow with coverage, as you just mentioned. And, until you have a definitive Democratic field, all of this is just, stuff that's interesting, but in terms of where's the dial going to end up November of 2014, I don't put a lot of stock in them.
What do you think the field will shape up like joining Charlie Crist? I mean, I think everybody feels very, very certain that he will be the one that probably will throw his hat in and be one of the big names. Do you think Alex Sink or some others will throw their names in as well? Have you had any sort of a barometer reading on that?
Not really. She's still talking about it. And again, one of the things that she doesn't have to worry about, nor does Crist, is name recognition. And one of the reasons that you have to start so early raising a lot of money, which of course requires a formal candidacy, is name recognition. And of course we see that with an announced candidate, Nan Rich, having a bit of difficulty getting the fundraising going, which is exactly what she needs because she doesn't have the name recognition and shows up as a blip on the polls. But she's doing something very smart, which is going to all the local Democratic clubs around the state, even though she's not registering highly in the polls, and introducing herself. And, that's how a lot of grassroots candidates start that are surprises in the end. If there are three candidates in the race, a Crist and a Sink and a Nan Rich, I think that it would be difficult to beat Crist in that. But if it's only one woman versus Crist, that's a different story, because in the Democratic primary, women greatly outnumber men, and so we're going to have an interesting wait and see period on who's going to run, but the dynamics of it could be very different depending upon if one or both of these women get in against Crist, if he runs.
What are your thoughts on the appearance of Adrian Wiley, the Libertarian candidate? I mean, are we seeing a shift that a third-party candidacy could at least be viable enough to make it into debates and make a presence known in a state like Florida? Because, I mean, we've really been very, very purple, but also the Libertarian groups have not been able, any third-party group hasn't really been able to crack into the mainstream beyond the two parties.
Again, what you saw in that poll was in anybody but the established parties. It wasn't the individual, the Libertarian person himself, because he isn't well known. But what you saw in that was basically a protest vote against the two major parties. But what we are watching in Florida is, and you put your finger on the pulse of it, is absolutely what will happen if a Libertarian gets into the governor's race and has money and can go around, because it has the potential, a Libertarian candidate that stresses invasion of privacy, the NSA, and a lot of things like that, can resonate with younger voters who, for the last couple of cycles, and last more than just a couple, have swung pretty heavily towards the Democrats. But Libertarian candidates have a great deal of appeal to younger voters who aren't registered, many of them, as Democrats or Republicans. So the Libertarian could be a spoiler, and it could be a spoiler for both parties in Florida, because it could peel off younger Democrats who really do not want government intruding into their personal lives, whether it's who they're talking to on the phone or who they're hooking up with.
Sure. And again, I don't want to get into too many more horse race numbers or anything like that in these other races for now. We don't have any Senate candidates that are up in Florida in the next cycle, but in the House, do we have any big names that are not going to be up for re-election, or any big names that have thrown their hats in that might be a little unexpected for listeners to hear?
Well, I think that in terms of the congressional races, we have the one that's getting the most traction right now is Bob Graham's daughter, Gwen Graham, is running against Sutherland in that district up in the Tallahassee area, which is a Democratic district, but voted for Sutherland last time over another Democratic candidate that was seen as a little bit too liberal, but it was a close race. So people are watching that. The Congress watchers are looking at that race and kind of watching it. Probably right now that's one of the bigger races. It's gotten a lot of publicity, but there are others in certain parts of the state. There's a couple down in South Florida. The Patrick Murphy seat is again one that's competitive, and he barely won last time over, I forget who he ran against, but so, and in terms of the state legislature, we have some local races, but none of those have gotten enough publicity. It's too far out, and the qualifying is not until the spring of next year. So, before I want to turn the page over, turn everything over to Bob here to get into some national and high-profile names and that kind of thing. What do you think is the trend? Because I know we hear a lot and we see a lot from a news standpoint of as you mentioned NSA, I think the IRS scandal and some different things like that. Do you feel like from an issue standpoint there is a lot more, let's say, animosity that's like you mentioned, the movement of the third party, and it's against establishment, that kind of, do you think that is actually rising and quelling, or is that just driven by the media cycle, the story of the day sort of thing? Good question. Really, and I should have said this more definitively, this coming year, if congressional ratings remain at the bottom of the barrel level along with the mainstream media ratings, it means that the conditions could be ripe for a strong anti-incumbent year. And those tend to happen more in midterms than they do in a presidential. So we're watchful of that particular trend. And the bottom line is that even though the focus next year will be on state races, whether congressional, legislative, local, whatever, people's opinions about government are largely based upon what they see in Washington. And they don't like what they see up there, and it's true for both parties. They're very dissatisfied with what seems to be a dysfunctional Congress. And so some of the big names traditionally that people think can never be upset, they can't just sit back and assume that's going to be the case next year if things continue like they are right now. All right. I know Bob wants to ask you more specifically about some of those, so let's go to a couple of those heats.
Good morning, Susan. Thanks for joining us.
My pleasure.
Great. I'd like to get your thoughts on some of the high-profile senators that are facing some primary challenges around the country. Let's start in Kentucky. We got Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell. He looks like he's facing challenges from both ends. There's a Tea Party candidate, businessman Matt Bevin. He'll be facing in the primaries, and then if he survives that, he gets to face a pretty popular Democratic Secretary of State, Allison Grimes. The McConnell campaign has other chaos going on. You got their campaign manager, Jesse Benton, from the Paul lineage, who was recently recorded saying he's holding his nose for the past 2 years or the next 2 years. So how much trouble is McConnell in?
Well, I certainly think that he can't just assume he's going to be a breeze in Kentucky because, he is a classic case of what happens when you get in a leadership post nationally, like he is with his party, and you get a lot of publicity. You are in the news constantly, and you're on a lot of these Sunday shows, and you say things that, while they seem pretty reasonable maybe to a national audience, don't really seem that great back home. And that's kind of one of the situations he finds himself in right now. And There is, excuse me, always a point at which people just get a little weary of politicians and want to try a new flavor. It's no different whether it's ice cream or politicians. You know, every now and then people just want to try something a little different. So that's what he's got to worry about. But I think one of the themes that you're seeing, the similarities and dynamics across a lot of these big profile races like the Kentucky race and the Senate race in South Carolina and Wyoming, is that you have some pretty formidable women candidates in the mix. And it tends to be true that when you have corruption or chaos, and we've seen plenty of that that you sometimes, a woman candidate can come in and is treated as maybe a fresh face and a little bit more honest and a little bit more willing to compromise. So I think this could be the next year could be driven by some upsets by women. And in the South, think of it, Nikki Haley won the governorship in South Carolina, Kentucky, Old South. So I think that McConnell really is nervous right now, to be honest.
Okay. Well, you did mention South Carolina, and from my perspective, I don't think I've ever seen someone draw so much ire from their own party as Lindsey Graham has. I mean, the opponents are coming out of the woodwork now. There's even a heavy grassroots opposition program called Defeat Lindsey Graham. We're actually going to have the founder of that on next week. But Graham is establishment, and he is loaded with cash. Any risk?
Yes, big risk.
Good.
He, even more than McConnell, is one that looks like he talks one way in Washington and another way in his home state. At least the perceptions are. And one of the things that I tell you, and you already know this, but some of your listeners, if you really want to follow races, you have to go and access the papers and the media from the state the race is taking place in. You can't just look at national coverage of these races. And there's a somewhat of a vitriol against Graham in South Carolina. And the political scientist who's the big analyst in South Carolina, I've known him for years, he's pretty good, has come out making some strong statements about the two faces of Lindsey Graham that in terms of how people in South Carolina are looking at him. I did notice, though, this morning that he and his good friend John McCain came out with strong statements about let's hold off foreign aid to Egypt. Now, those kind of statements, moving more on the fiscal conservatism path, could help him a lot, because there's definitely we're helping everybody else but not our own people kind of sentiment at the moment with this sort of flat economy, and it's worse in some of these states that we're talking about than nationally even.
Okay, and let's swing to Wyoming, because we're getting short on time, and this primary challenge really confuses me a little bit. You got a relatively popular Republican, Mike Enzi, there, and there's Liz Cheney, who's going after this seat as a quote-unquote Washington outsider. What's Liz Cheney's motivation for this? Because Mike Enzi, he doesn't draw the ire of anybody.
And she still has favorability ratings, but of course these early polls show that she isn't getting a whole lot of traction yet. But sometimes you see candidacies like hers and you think, okay, you got to get your name up, run once, and then run again. I'm sort of looking at that race like maybe she's thinking about that so she loses this, then she moves on to run for governor or something else. So, but yet we'll have to wait and see, because if things get worse in Congress, no matter if Lindsey is popular, she could get onto that swell of the anti-Washington, throw them all out kind of sentiment.
But she's hardly anti-Washington.
Well, that's her problem, is she's just moved in, and sometimes we think, oh, well, people don't like that, but look at Hillary Clinton, who did that in New York. So, I mean, you never say never, but I really think hers is more of a, let me get serious about running for office, and this isn't the end of my efforts. Okay,
we're coming to the bottom of the hour. If I can get you, just give me a 15-second blurb. What's your thoughts on the Republican infighting that's going on right now? The Paul versus Christie versus King versus McCain versus Cruz, blah, blah, blah.
What it ends up doing is tamping down turnout, and that's the worst thing that can happen to parties, and that's the thing that has to be most fearful for Republicans is a lot of infighting just makes people who might have been leaning in that direction say it isn't worth my effort to go vote. And we had a definite fall off in Republican turnout in Florida in the 2012 vote, and a lot of it was because of all these negative ads that just made a lot of people say neither Obama nor Romney were appealing, and so I'm just not going to vote.
Okay. Well, Susan, thanks for joining us today, and we hope you can come back and visit us again. Dr. Susan MacManus with the University of South Florida, thanks for joining us today.
You're welcome.
All right, bye-bye.
Wow, it's great. We were definitely going to have her on again regularly to help keep some of the names flowing around so we can kind of keep track of what's going on. And as she says, the local papers are just invaluable to try to understand what the true on-the-ground sentiment is to this thing. So with that, we're going to take just a very quick break, couple commercials, come right back, have Dr. Chan on with us from the hour.
This is Brandon from Dispatch Radio, and I want to tell you about my friends over at Stout Auto. Now, I don't know about you, but I can't stand car repair shops. I hate hearing about all the things that are wrong with my car. Even if they're true, I just want my oil changed. Now, the only thing worse than car repair is having to take it back again when it breaks down for what I just had done the first time. Now, recently, I had some work done on my mother-in-law's car. Spent a pretty penny, only to have the same thing start all over again. Now, this person may have meant well, and I don't really have any ill will, but I learned a valuable lesson, that I can trust Jody and his team over at Stout Auto. Not only did they fix everything, explain what else needed to be done, they did it in a professional manner with estimates that I could understand, and I left feeling that my daughter, if she took her car in there for an oil change, wouldn't come home with a $600 bill. One trip, one good repair, I didn't have to go back. Now, they've been in business in Clearwater for over 4 years. 18300 US 19 North. It's in Clearwater at 727-216-6622. Now they have a new location that's off Belcher at 1801 Belcher Road, just 1 block north of Ulmerton. Give them a call. That's 727-400-6955. 2 locations, going to do you right, get you in and out. Tell them the Global Dispatch sent you.